morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome to our forum programs. Our programs occur most Sundays at noon, and they're free and open to the public. Our mission is to nourish the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. For more information about our forum programming, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org and click on Public Affairs Forum. We also have some connections to YouTube up there with some forums from previous weeks, so we encourage that. And now, one of our forum committee members, Richard Halpin, will be introducing today's speaker, Jere Locke. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Bonnie. And Bonnie didn't mention, but she and our co-chair, Leslie Kearns, have led this outfit now for a long time, and it is the longest-running public policy forum in the city of Austin. So, thank you guys for your great leadership. Our speaker today, Alyssa Bergen, was called to Poland to be the matron of honor at her cousin's wedding. I tried to talk her out of it, but it didn't last very long. She called to share the good news and additional good news that her co-founder of the Texas Drought Project would take her place at today's forum. This is a win-win situation for all concerned. Don't mourn, organize, is a quote attributed to the songwriter and labor organizer Joe Hill. In this time of climate catastrophe, we have much to authentically mourn about, the poisoning of our precious air, water, and earth. Today at this forum, we are fortunate to have an extraordinary champion of our sacred earth and her people, Jere Locke. Jere is the program director as well as the co-founder of the Texas Drought Project. Jere also founded the Texas Fair Trade Coalition in 1999, when he was hired to organize on the free trade area of the Americas, NAFTA on steroids, and Fast Track. He has extensive experience on both environmental issues and the growth of corporate global domination with its attack on our democratic practices. Jere now works primarily on climate change and related issues such as fracking and trade agreements. Jere is an organizer. Jere is a community leader I've seen up close, organized to create reasons to celebrate, not mourn. Jere is an organizer's organizer. Jere brings people in. Jere invites all to create the reasons not to mourn. If we can pull out of this climate catastrophe, it will be because we all work successfully to change the current course of our destiny. And it will be because we have organizers like Brother Jere Locke to make sure that many, not just the few, are involved in that success. Did I share with you that Jere is the father of 2 sons and a grandfather of 2 wonderful granddaughters, aged 3 and 1? Well, being this is Father's Day, I'd like to share with you that I'm a brand new grandfather, and it is a remarkable experience. Can I get an amen here? Are there any parents in the house today? Can you put up your hands and give us a parent wave? Very good. Thank you. Are there any grandparents in the house today? Put up your hands a little higher. You've got to be a little bit more proud than that. There you go. Now we're seeing some grandparents. Well, you parents, grandparents, and those of you who are not either yet, you understand what I'm about to share with you. It is the future of these children that concerns and drives Jere to help save our sacred earth. Please give Jere a warm welcome.
Alyssa was going to talk about fracking and asked me to talk about fracking. But as soon as I thought of fracking, I thought of what happened to the Denton Dam. And as soon as I thought of that, I looked at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I've worked a lot on over the last 1.5, 2 years. And there's an investor-state provision in it. It's very similar to what happened here. And as soon as I thought of it, I thought of structural adjustment programs all over the Global South. The Global South is what we used to call the Third World. And they've renamed themselves the Global South. And so all of this is kind of whole cloth. It's different instruments that end up doing the same thing. We've kind of been spared that for a long time. It's been done in our name, but it's been done to others. And at this point, it's starting to happen here. And the Denton ban was just a tiny, tiny little bit. The overturn of that was just a tiny, tiny little bit. What happens elsewhere is that they use the instruments of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, and they use something called a structural adjustment program. They also use trade agreements there to enforce this orthodoxy. People in the Global South call it the Washington Consensus, because a lot of the power for this comes out of Washington. And structural adjustment, and for them, and I really see a lot of my work through the eyes of people elsewhere, because I've had lots of experience with people elsewhere. And so I kind of always check back as I encounter work here, what would those people think? Because they've educated me to a large extent kind of about globalization. All my best teachers are from outside the United States, and they're good people in the United States on this issue, but my best teachers have been outside the United States. And they don't see, and this is real important, they don't see any difference between Republicans and Democrats. None. They don't see any difference between Republicans and Democrats. Democratic administrations support IMF and World Bank policies. Republican administrations do the same thing. Democratic administrations support trade agreements like Obama did recently with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Republicans do the same thing. NAFTA was under a Democratic president. TPP is under a Democratic president. So that's real important to understand, that they see things quite differently than I did before I got involved, and that I'm sure a lot of people in this room see. But it's worthwhile kind of considering their perspective. When I first got involved in all of this, I was in a little study group here in Austin. There were about 5 or 6 of us. It was about 6 months before the WTO protest in Seattle. And we started studying something called the MAI, or a Multilateral Agreement on Investments, which I'm not sure if anyone here would know what that is, but it was the first big attempt at kind of corporate governance. It was a big attempt, and it was completely hidden from view, except that a woman, as I understand it, Maud Berlot with the Council of the Canadians, was leaked a copy, and she released on the Internet, and people went, oh my goodness. And so it went away, and so we studied that for a little bit, and then all of a sudden someone said, well, we should study the WTO. And maybe that person knew something about WTO, but none of the rest of us did. We were 3 months before Seattle. We had not a clue. I had not a clue about what happened in NAFTA and kind of the complexity of it. And so I went to Seattle, and I learned and learned and learned and learned. There were the best speakers, speakers from throughout the world were there. And so from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 or 10 o'clock at night, I would go for hear one speaker after another at places that were spread out through downtown. I also went to the demonstrations, but I learned a whole lot. One of the things I learned about that I didn't know up to then, and this is the IMF and World Bank. There's a UN study that was in, I think, 97. I tried to find it, but I couldn't find it. And basically, they found that 19,000 children a day, or individuals a day, mostly children, die every single day through conscious policy of the IMF. And what happens with that is that for instance, in South Africa, the apartheid government ran up lots of debt with banks. None of this can, help the people the poor people of South Africa. It was all used for different purposes, a lot of it for oppression. But they were stuck with repaying that debt. And so they had to forego some of the things they dearly wanted, like land reform and like education expansion and like housing and like getting water to their people. Same thing in the Congo. You had another dictator, Mobutu. 90% of the external debt of Congo, this is my figures from back in the early 2000s, was due to Mobutu. And structural adjustment programs were imposed on those people. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, and Kenyatta, who was a tyrant and a thief, like so many are, that was completely supported by our government, and he ended up with $5 billion, as I understand, and there was more structural adjustment programs there. I met Julius Nyerere is one of the great leaders of Africa. He was the president of Tanzania for a long time. He was called Walimu, or teacher. And they got a structural adjustment program, and in all of these countries, to get just enough money to pay the interest on the debt, they have to agree to a whole string of things. And this isn't a negotiation. This is dictation. And I remember that I talked to his daughter, and she said we had 147 items so that we could just get enough money to pay the interest on the debt. And some of these things that they do is you have to gut your environmental law. You have to gut your labor law. A long time ago, I brought Charlotte Mwasije, who's from Uganda, here to give a speech at the Dell complex, and she said, if we had just had a little bit of money to educate the army and the truck drivers in Uganda, we could have done a huge amount in stopping the spread of AIDS. But our health care system was decimated by structural adjustment program. And I could go on, but that sort of thing has been happening to people in much of the world for a very long period of time, and we don't know about that. I actually had a graduate student who did a study of the kind of there's a lot of the media doesn't cover issues like that. They don't cover TPP also, and they don't cover a lot of things in this regard. In Latin America, they know about these programs, and in Africa they know about these programs. I gave a lot of talks about the free trade area of the Americas. Hundreds probably, and no one knew what a structural adjustment program was. But I talked to the African Student Association at the University of Texas, and I said, "Do you know what a structural adjustment program is?" And every one of them raised their hands, because it's common knowledge elsewhere, and it's being dictated to them and for a very long period of time. What I want to talk, and other things, privatizing water systems. The last I heard, when I kind of left this work that I was doing, they were trying to privatize 19 water systems in Africa. I don't know if you all know what privatization is too much. I didn't know what it was until 97, and I dealt with a campaign to stop the privatization of Texas jobs and Department of Human Services and that sort of thing. And companies come in and they want to make money, and they cut services is the first thing they do, and then they cut salaries and they cut number of employees, and so you get very bad services and that are much more expensive, and the company owns your water system at this point. Ghana was forced to sell its water system for less than it had just spent to modernize it. It's when there's a little bit of there's interest on the debt that's owed, and the Wall Street banks come in and they say, we'll give you enough money to pay the interest on your debt, and if you'll do the following things. And the structural adjustment programs are those 147 things in Tanzania, the aid money in Uganda, it's health issues also. It's a whole range of issues that are just starting to come to roost in the United States. people also know, that back not too long ago, there was a real revolution that started happening in Latin America. Philip would probably know about this, about the Cochabamba Declaration in Bolivia. And basically, they tried to privatize their water system. And it was so outrageous that they couldn't even collect rainwater off their roofs. And people, there was a revolt, in the city of Cochabamba. And they issued a declaration, which is well known between, those people that deal with kind of water on an international level. It was quite a moment because they enforced their wishes. They weren't going to let this happen to them. And Morales, he basically, the new socialist president, is a product of that revolution and a lot of the other work that people did. And together with him and Chavez and a bunch of other people, they elected a lot of democratic socialist presidents all over Latin America because they had had enough of the Washington consensus, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, being imposed on them. Like, we don't like what happened to the Denton ban, what the legislature did to that. Well, it's many, 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 many times past the little thing that happened to us, which is not a little thing. But in relation to what's done to other people, it is kind of a little thing. So you've had Latin America has made this huge movement forward. When I was working on the free trade area of the Americas, which all of you probably, I bet most people in this room don't know what that was. Jim Hightower described it as NAFTA on steroids, and it was NAFTA for all the countries in America, from Chile to Canada. And we didn't win the vote like on fast track, which is, it greases the skid. It establishes the rules for the debate on the coming trade agreement and makes it much, much easier for that to pass. And that's what was just voted on in the U.S. Congress. We lost, but the people of Latin America said, no, we're not going to accept that. Their governments wanted to, a lot of their governments wanted to accept it, but they imposed their will on the governments. They'd had enough. And that's why you had a lot of democratic socialists. One reason they came to office is because this mass movement that was starting to happen in Latin America. That CUT is you probably know what CUT is in Brazil, but it's the labor union coalition in Brazil, and they had a vote on this, and they had 10 million people vote on it. The labor union coalition organized this vote against neoliberalism or structural adjustment programs, that whole package. And I didn't know. I didn't have a clue before I went to Seattle, and then was started to be educated by other people. There's lots of opposition to this all over the world. I went to the protest, the WTO in Hong Kong. I was in Asia. I asked someone who knew someone, could I be a volunteer in the office, and I was, and then the Koreans came. 1,700 Koreans came for the WTO protest, and they were very, very organized. I mean, none of us had ever seen anything like that. 1,700 of them. I could go on and on stories about the Koreans, but they take this, and they were peasant farmers and labor union people, but more like laborers. This isn't high-level union people. These were laborers. And they know what the WTO and all of this world does to them, and they were going to fight back, and they fought back. When they were blocked, they charged police barricades. When they were blocked, they would jump into the harbor and try to float around the block to the conference center. I was sitting there looking at the conference center, and all of a sudden behind me, there were about 100 Koreans had jumped into the harbor, in a very cold harbor, and tried to float around. I'm just telling you that it was very organized, and they were very determined, very determined. In Seattle, a lot of the opposition wasn't because the people in the streets, it was the African delegation. and other delegations within the WTO that said no. When the talks failed in Cancun, it was the African delegation that said no, this isn't going to happen. And they walked out and announced that the talks were over. They're very militant about these things because they pay a really heavy price. Remember, 19,000 people die a day, every single day, because of these structural adjustment programs and monetary policy that's very thought out. And people know the consequences, and yet it goes on and on and on. Now we have a great champion, a real sign of hope. Bob Cash and I, we've both been working on like I said, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it wasn't too long ago, when we got a sense of what the Pope was going to say, we were just so overjoyed. This was amazing news. And the news wasn't about climate change. I've spent the last 7 years almost completely devoted to climate change and various, struggles around that. The big thing for me and the big thing for a lot of people is the fact that he came out against capitalism. Very determined statements about capitalism. He's been doing this, I did Google searches since 2013. He didn't come out just for action in climate change. This is a real important thing to understand. He came out against capitalism. He, like I, think that in a capitalist economy that we're too compromised and we will never meet the needs of climate change. Never, ever, ever, ever. And I've seen that in the Waxman-Markey bill, which was the bill in 2008 and 2009. We and Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and other groups came out against it at the end because it was so full of market mechanisms that the corporations supported, but they've never been successful and never will be successful, and everyone knows that. I don't want to go into all the details of market mechanisms, but I would like to, but I have kind of a limited time. So the Pope wrote this encyclical, but he's the first Pope from the Global South. And the first draft of the encyclical was written by a cardinal in Ghana. So you have two people from the Global South, and I think that's why it's such a radical document. Because they come out of places with these big social movements that understand well, way beyond most of us in this room, what capitalism does to their people. I have a couple quotes from he also, I have a note to myself, he put climate justice language in, embedded it into his encyclicals, stuff that I've only seen in the groups that I work in, that I've never seen kind of outside that world. I see it, the people that I know elsewhere in Latin America or Africa, but I've never seen it outside, and he embedded it into his encyclical. Real important languages. I wanted to read a couple of his quotes because I think it's real important to understand what he just did. This is Naomi Klein. She wrote The Shock Doctrine and other books. She's a prominent author. She said, frankly, it's also a challenge to Hillary Clinton, the Pope, and Barack Obama, and to large parts of the Green movement, because it is a rebuke of slow action. It very specifically says that climate denial is not just about denying the science. It's also about denying the urgency of the science. It is also about denying the urgency of the science. I could say this about almost any green group that I know of. I just participated in the steering committee of the Rewrite Austin's Climate Protection Plan. And I don't know that much, but I know good science, and I've read a lot over the last 7 years, and so I brought that to the steering committee. People accepted it, but they just couldn't wrap their heads around it. The urgency of the moment. They just couldn't wrap their heads around it. Nice people, and they just could. So we have a document that's nothing, next to nothing, because it never, they started, there were too much talk of gloom and doom, basically pointing fingers at me, and all I was doing was quoting the best science that we have, the best scientific organizations that we have. I was just relaying what these people were telling us. I could go on for a while about that, but it's quite disturbing. what they're telling us. What's going to happen in the lifetime of my children, in the lifetime of my grandchildren, and not way when they're older. It could be a decade or two. The best wind and ice scientists are telling us it could be a decade or two. And I won't go into a lot of that, but it's just. What she's absolutely right about the urgency of science and green groups. The document is very strong in condemning delays, half measures, so-called market solutions, which I was talking about. It very specifically criticizes carbon markets, one of those things. The carbon offsetting as an adequate measure that will encourage speculation and rampant consumption. That's her take on what the Pope had just written. There's another one that's the Pope himself. This imbalance is the result of ideologies, the imbalance between rich and poor, which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states, the people of Denton, charged with vigilance for the common good, which is a ban on fracking in their community, to exercise any form of control. Denton ban on fracking. A new tyranny is thus born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. That's what's been happening to people in Asia, Africa, Latin America for decades, and it's starting to poke up its head here. So then I wanted to look at what's already happened in the United States. First is Citizens United. I think everyone understands about Citizens United and the role that money is playing now in our election. So I don't need to go into that. I also wanted to say again something about Waxman Markey, because I went all in Waxman Markey, and the foundation I went all in. And we gave away all our money because that was our one shot at doing something that we thought. And it was. It was the climate bill in 2008 and 2009. It was the climate bill in this country. And it was it had so many offsets in it, which are ways for corporations to say, we don't want to do anything in this country. We'll save a forest in Indonesia, except that forest might burn down. And then what have they saved at that point? Or we'll put scrubbers in this factory in China, except the factories had already put in the scrubbers, and this was after the fact. And on corruption. So no emissions were saved in these schemes. That's what offsets is. And that's what a capitalist economy does, is use market mechanisms, things that the corporations like, to try to address a problem like climate change, and it just won't work. So I want to talk a little bit about NAFTA, just a little bit, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We just had the vote in the House. We lost. The old trade agreements were 20 pages. The new trade agreements starting with NAFTA are 550 pages. This one's 2,000 pages. The reason is because they used to be about simple things like bananas or steel going across the border. Now they're really corporate rights treaties. They're written by corporations who give the text of the treaty to trade representatives in all the countries, and they are allowed to be part of the negotiations. Obama allowed 600 corporate people had complete access to the negotiations right from the beginning. Obama allowed that. There were no union people involved. There were no environmental people involved. There were no Congress people involved. Finally, some Congress people said, we need to at least look at it. So Grayson, he was pretty remarkable. He's from Florida, representative, and he was ushered into a room. He couldn't have paper and pen. He couldn't bring an aide. He could only look at it. And then he was prohibited by law. He could be arrested if he said anything about what he saw. And that's pretty much where it is to this day, this huge trade agreement. He said, I could be arrested if I tell you. All I can tell you is it's much worse than you think it is. So that and Bill Moyers did a really good documentary about 2000 or something called Trading Democracy. It was about this whole thing. Really good documentary. I'm going to go over some little elements of it. One element that I'll start with is that it extends patents. AIDS drug patents, all sorts of patents of all sorts of drugs. What that means is to a lot of people in the world, they die. There are 37 million people in the world with AIDS. This is 2012 WHO figures. 37 million. 9 million get AIDS drugs. The rest die. That's a horrible situation. It'll be made even worse when these patents are extended. They and their governments cannot afford AIDS drugs. Just can't afford it. Some of the most vigorous in the Asian countries, vigorous protesters are people not just with AIDS, but they're healthcare advocates, essentially, a lot of whom have illnesses that they're going to die of if they can't get a generic drug. Investor state provision. Everyone should understand what investor state. What it does is every law, regulation, and judicial opinion in our country can be overturned by a foreign corporation. Every single one of them can be overturned by, let's say NAFTA, by a Canadian or Mexican company can come to the United States and challenge any law, regulation, or judicial opinion, and the case will be heard not in, say it's a Mexican company, not in a Mexican court or U.S. court. The case will be heard in a secret tribunal, the jurists of which are largely corporate lawyers, and it's completely secret. And they guess how they usually rule. This has happened. This isn't speculation. This has happened. And it's happening more and more, especially outside the United States, but it's going to start happening in the United States. Two small examples. This is part of the fracking part of this. That Ottawa passed a law to ban fracking in the St. Lawrence River, their major river. They're being sued by an American fracker to overturn their law. If they don't overturn their law, they'll have to pay for lost profits. Whatever the fracker says, that's what they'll have to pay. And so this is their choice: overturn their law or pay lost profits forevermore. The same thing with El Salvador. They don't have any water treatment plants, and they have lots of gold mining, lots of toxic chemicals get into the water. They said, enough, we don't want this. They're being sued by a Canadian company that established an office in the United States under the trade agreement called CAFTA, and they're being sued like 300 and something million and 75 million in another suit, and so they'll be faced with the same thing. That's investor state. It's in NAFTA. It's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's in every big trade agreement at this point. Privatization. I didn't know anything about privatization a long time ago, and this paves the way for lots of privatization. I wish I could. So, for instance, Austin Energy and Austin Water Utility could theoretically, and not very theoretically, be privatized if a Mexican company or Canadian company said, "Oh, we deal in that, and your public ownership of these two utilities is a barrier to free trade. It hinders our profits," and they would take this to a NAFTA tribunal. That isn't theoretical. It can happen. It's happened elsewhere. It just hasn't come to roost here yet. It prohibits government ability to regulate banks. It prohibits limiting size of financial institutions, too big to fail. It makes it harder to have food safety regulations based on the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle was something where you err on the side of precaution. You protect people's health if there's any question at all. That's been largely overturned through these trade agreements. So all of these are in almost every trade agreement at this point. So I think this is a big problem. And Joe Hill was right, we need to organize. Richard, thank you for that, because he's absolutely true. This isn't something to get depressed about. Please don't get depressed about it. please figure out what things that you can do, and I'll have some of the things that we might do. Fracking. I want to go to I've talked about what the legislature did. What I want to talk about really briefly is water usage. City of New York City was concerned about their water, which comes from upstate New York, and they heard about all the chemicals in fracking, so they commissioned a study. What this study found, based on industry data, that's real important, based on industry data, they didn't make it up, that 140 to 570 tons of chemicals are used in every single frac on average. That's per 7 million gallons, which is about an average of a gas frac. 140 to 570 tons of chemicals. University of Missouri Medical School found 700 chemicals in an average frac. It's proprietary knowledge. We're not supposed to know this, so they went along the roads and scooped up fracking fluid and analyzed it. Shouldn't happen like that. There are 120, since 2003 to 2011, there are about 120,000 fracking wells that have been drilled. On average, it uses 6 million gallons of water. That's 760 billion gallons of water that have been used already. Not used, destroyed because of all the chemicals. And that doesn't include the gas, the oil wells that frack. They use less water, but there are more of them. So this 760 is a really low figure. We couldn't find the number of oil wells. It's a low figure. Again, you need to organize. You need to figure out a way we can stop this. Health impacts. New York banned fracking just on one issue. Health impacts. Not the water in New York State. Nothing else. One issue, health impacts. Because these 700 chemicals, a lot of them are volatile organic compounds that get into the air, and they wreak havoc. I'm not going to go into all of that, but you can imagine all these chemicals getting into the air and what they do to people in the fracking fields, what they do to the workers in the plants in the shale. And we're fixing to buy our energy from frack gas, which is something I want to talk to right at the end. Emissions. It's really bad for emissions. Methane is a particularly horrible greenhouse gas. It's 86 to 105 times the potency of CO2. 86 to 105 times the potency of CO2. Lots of it are released in the frac, in the storage, and the transportation. There are lots of good studies, especially National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has done really wonderful work. And some guys at Cornell at the beginning of this. So you have all this methane. A number of studies, a bunch of studies, have found that it's equivalent of coal in terms of emissions when you consider all the methane that's released in the frac, in the storage, and the transportation. So that isn't someplace I think we want to get our energy from. It's also a particularly horrible chemical because it's accumulating in huge quantities in the ocean floor, and that's what these wind and ice scientists were talking about when it gets released. They expect a methane burp that's about 1.5 times total global and yearly emissions that will come up in one burp. That's a tipping point. And they're pretty sure, some of them, that this is absolutely going to happen relatively soon. So we don't want to be encouraging methane release. We don't want to be encouraging a gas plant. Some of the things that you probably do is educate yourself is the important thing. I'm going to pass these out. And they have sources of information on them. Two of the books that I recommend, one's by Naomi Klein, but Walden Bellow and Mark Berlow are real heroes of mine. They both won alternative Nobel Prizes or Right Livelihood Awards, And his book, one of them is I read, and it was so good, and it was so short at the same time. But it's a very, very good book. So educate yourself. There are websites on there if you want to learn about trade. You can go to Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. If you want to, you can also go to the Citizens Campaign website, which includes the Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth and farmers and unions and religious organizations and lots of other folks. The other thing is that Richard and I and Becky and the Buellas and a lot of other people are trying to stop a gas plant from being built here. And so this is information about that gas plant. The one piece of information that isn't included is the fact that Georgetown, I don't know if a bunch of you might have read, they recently signed long-term contracts for wind and solar for one reason, and only one reason: it was cheaper over the long haul. They did their study for a couple of years, and that this is what they found. The Google that I'm suggesting will lead you to an op-ed that was written by the mayor of Georgetown. Very conservative guy. One reason it was decided. We need people to invite us to their civic clubs. That's real important to us. We're trying to network throughout this community. So if you're in a civic club, we have a bunch of good speakers. And so just get in touch with us. On the back of that, there's a blue square, and you can contact Kaiba White, a public citizen, and we'll get you a speaker there. But this is real and vital that you invite us. So the gas plant is something really tangible you can do here. Another thing is the whole thing about the Democratic Party is betrayed us. The leadership of the Democratic Party has betrayed us. I think it's seen most clearly in NAFTA. It was seen again in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We lost because of one reason, because Obama made call after call after call after call after call, hundreds of calls to Congress people trying to persuade them. He made rounds of those calls. There was immense pressure on these people. We lost too many Democrats. We lost Beto O'Rourke in El Paso and Eddie Bernice Johnson in Dallas and Hinojosa in the Valley, and it seems like I'm overlooking someone. I can't remember it right now. We got enough Republicans. We got more Republicans than we thought we would get. We lost too many Democrats. So I think, for me personally, I'm rethinking. I've joined a Democratic Socialist organization. This might be pie in the sky. If you don't feel comfortable with socialism, think of populism. And here are a couple of really good books about populist movement and earlier in the United States. I think I've got this right. There were 58 biweekly, I think, newspapers in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas at kind of the turn of the last century. 58 of them. There were more card-carrying socialists in Oklahoma than in New York City because they had had enough. And for me, I've already had enough. So I think we need to push the Democratic Party, but I think we need to seriously consider alternatives too.
15 minutes left till we have time for questions.
I will finish. And move to amend is real important. If you haven't gotten involved in some move to amend, which is about Citizens United, please Google Move to Amend Texas, and you can hook up with an organization. Now questions. I've talked enough. Way too much.
Okay, raise your hands high so I can see them if you have a question.
David Hogan, this is related, but I'm sure you have some knowledge on this. We voted a couple of $1 billion for a water development board here in Texas. Could you comment on how that's going? Is it
not very well? You mean Proposition 6? I was against it, and a lot of, Bill Bunch of SOS and a lot of environmentalists came out against it because what they were building were evaporation pits. We need water underground. We need to store our water underground. You can even store it in sand. There's lots of underground places that are empty that we could be storing our water and not dealing with evaporation. We needed that. It was a really bad. I know people were desperate. They needed to do something about it, but that was a really bad idea. And also, it was mainly about the contractors and the developers and the real estate people, because they want these reservoirs and then they'll build all sorts of stuff around it. It wasn't just $2 billion. The state, with all the infrastructure that would have to be done, it was like $250 billion. I think that's a figure that Bill Bunch was using. So not a very good idea. There are smart ways that we can save water, lots of conservation. But the leadership of the Texas Water Development Board and TCEQ, they're all climate deniers, and they don't take this seriously. So it wasn't a very good bill. But I understand why it passed, because people were desperate for something, but they were being offered the wrong solution.
We have a question from Martha Shoemaker. Would you stand, Martha?
You said something that I didn't understand about Ottawa passed something, and I think, would you repeat what you said
there?
Sure.
That's worth repeating. The government of Ottawa, a U.S. fracker wanted to frack through their biggest river, the St. Lawrence River. And so they passed a law, you can't do that. And they're being sued by an American fracker who wants to do that drilling. And they will be forced, almost for sure, to pay reparations or make up for what the fracker thinks are lost profits. And the fracker pretty much defines what those lost profits are. And this has happened all over Latin America before. It isn't anything new. Canada's had, they used to be, they're not so great right now, but they wanted to protect their environment. They've had a lot of things overturned under NAFTA already.
We have a question from Richard Halpin. Richard?
Thank you so much for your talk today. It was really quite a scope of information. So thank you very much. Very informative. About fracking, tell us about the fracking situation that we face in Texas, in Central Texas, in the state of Texas. How many, you made a comparison about to 2011, but then currently, from 2013, 14, 15, how many fracking wells do we have in Texas? And so what? What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of our environment? And don't we need that gas to have an energy future?
No, we don't. You know that. Georgetown has given us, they're leading the way on this. They've already done their homework and decided that gas is more expensive than wind and solar, and they signed their contracts. There's shale every place, and almost every place, if you look at maps of where the shale is, Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford Shale through the south, the Barnett Shale, there are aquifers attached to all those places, all of them. And there's also shale under Austin. They're already starting to drill in Bastrop and Lee counties. Not a lot yet, but if they discover what they think is there will be a lot of drilling in Lee and Bastrop counties. So it's pernicious. And one thing that I failed to say is that all the water that's used and destroyed, California, they found fracking fluids in 8 of their aquifers. California, they found fracking fluids in 8 of their aquifers. So it isn't just the water they use in the frack that's destroyed. It's seeping into all the other groundwater, and that's starting to happen. There was a guy that Wall Street Journal, he wrote a book called The Boom. It was pro-fracking. I went to the last end of his lecture. I went up at the end, and I said, do you think that those fracking fluids in the water are just going to be encased in steel for the rest of until eternity? And he said, no, they're not. And I was using like 10, 20, 50 years maximum. They're going to make their way into our groundwater. And even this pro-fracking author said, no, it isn't going to. It's going to get there eventually.
We have a question from Douglas Bauer. Douglas?
Thank you. One of the weaknesses of classical free market capitalism is the mispricing of pollution.
Yes.
Historically, it's been close to zero. And one way to amend that would be a carbon tax. My question to you is, what do you think about a carbon tax, and what sort of tax would you envision if you do like it?
Oh, I'm a real friend of, I can't go to their meetings because I'm busy with other things, but Citizen Climate Lobby, they're completely wonderful. And basically, you would do a tax, but then that tax would be distributed back to people. It would set up a higher price on carbon, but then the money that was collected would be distributed back to people. I think they're doing wonderful work. That's something I should have put in the little handout. Citizens Climate Lobby. Susan Adams and Anna Graybeal are kind of the guiding lights, but there are lots of people that are working really, really hard. They get lots of letters to the editor, and they're well worth supporting. Did that answer?
We have another question right here. Would you stand and say your name, please?
Hi, I'm Tonda Rasco. I have two questions that are related on fracking, especially just south of here, not all that far, less than 100 miles downwind of Austin. We have lots and lots of fracking wells emitting lots of gases. Are there any groups other than the beleaguered EPA who are doing air testing related to this? And also, as far as water testing, I've been looking into the tar sands issue and fracking and water pollution. A lot of the cities, such as Dallas, is not testing for even the big four chemicals. They're not even testing for it.
I know.
And
neither
the
is
pipeline
the EPA.
goes through their water supply.
The EPA did a recent study, and they talked a little bit about water, and they completely underestimated, but they didn't do anything about the air issue. And if Alyssa was here, she could answer this much better than I can. But I know she lives in San Antonio, and they're having problems with what do you call the air. If your air gets too polluted, there are economic consequences, and they're right on the verge of that because a lot of wind is taking it from the shale fields, the Eagle Ford Shale, up into San Antonio. So pollution of that sort is also real important. Did that answer your question? Groups. Yeah, I mean, we deal with fracking. Lissa more than I, but we work together. There's Sharon Wilson, who does Blue Haze blog. She's kind of the main person in Texas because she's employed by Earthworks. So Blue Haze blog, Sharon Wilson, is real important. There's the wonderful Sister Elizabeth, who's living in Victoria, I think, right now, grew up in Cuero, and she's all over the Eagle Ford Shale. I mean, all over, all the time. So if people, my email's there, if you want information about Sharon Wilson and Sister Elizabeth, just send me an email, and I'll give you that information. They're real important figures.
We have about 4.5 minutes left. Do you want to tell us about a few victories that you've had in your efforts and activism?
Oh, don't do that.
Even minor ones.
You know, what I want to talk about, I guess, I'll talk about that too, but I wanted to have a little video of what they're doing in Australia about fracking. It's quite amazing. The resistance there is way beyond anything that we could contemplate here. If you sign this, which I'm going to pass out now, this is for the gas plant, the resistance to the gas plant, which low volume emails, but I can send you a video of what's happening in Australia. I was just blown away. I'd heard about it through someone that had gone there and was really knowledgeable. They're chasing frackers out of town. And they have huge marches through the city because around 50% of their land has been taken over by oil and gas interests. 50% of their land has been taken over by oil and gas interests. I will send you that. I looked for it, and I was actually going to tried. It was the one thing that I thought people might see, or kind of the scope of the resistance there. Victories. We had victories even losing this time. The three of us, which was Alyssa, Cash, and myself, we, with the help of a whole network of other people, and the unions especially, they were really the stalwarts of trying to fight TPP. But environmental groups weighed in, and I consider that coalition a real victory. And we saved votes. We lost too many, but we saved votes that we might have lost if people hadn't worked and worked and worked and worked. And anyone that got emails from me knows that about every 2 weeks there would be another opportunity to send you an email because it just changed and morphed. So I think that I did this back in the early 2000s, and it was basically me running around 17 congressional districts. The environmental groups didn't understand it yet. The unions understood it, but all they wanted to do was give $5,000 checks to their congressperson, which was ridiculous. And people didn't understand, and they just didn't understand. They didn't understand. The media didn't cover it at all. Like the media, I wanted to say something about the Statesman. They really did not. All the things I said about trade agreements, you won't find it in a Statesman article. So people don't really have a sense of what this will do. There's a little bit of information about jobs, but Obama says more jobs. Well, the Korean trade agreement lost 80,000 jobs in 2 years. NAFTA lost us net about 1 billion jobs in 2 years. So that sort of resistance is important. I think that there are more of us that understand, and to me, that's a victory. I think we're going to have a victory on the gas plant, but we need help. There's just a small group of us, about 8 or 9 of us, that are the core group, which always happens. But we need help from everyone in the community to kind of get the word out about this gas plant.
I think that we're unfortunately out of time. We want to thank you for your commitment to clean energy and environmental preservation, vitally important issues in today's world. And thank you again for coming to talk with us, Jere Locke.